Hello, and welcome to the First Person Podcast. It's been a little while, but we're kicking things off.
Hi, I'm Chris Lawrence. I am the current co-editor-in-chief of First Person Scholar, and you can find me on Twitter at @QuipsLawrence.
Hi, I'm Leah Black. I am the current commentary section head for First Person Scholar. You can find me on Twitter at Lillian_A_Black.
Hi, my name's Patrick. I am the current book reviews editor for First Person Scholar, and you can find me walking around Toronto at times.
So we're gathered here once again for First Person Scholar's time-honored annual tradition at this point, it seems, of not exactly going through a game of the year, but more so picking one game or a few among each of us that meant something to each of us over the last year or so. Sometimes this includes contemporary games. It could be a game that came out in 2019, but need not necessarily be so. Now, we often choose these games for different reasons and different numbers and different quantities, but we'll see what kinds of connections we can form between our picks through the conversation. So without a whole lot more preamble or fanfare, I thought we could start with Patrick.
Well, so I guess we're in the new year, and we're reading a bunch of best of lists, and we're all just loving that we've played so many games that came out in 2019 last year, and I guess, does someone want to start off with a game they played last year? One thing I found about last year is the best games I played were not from 2019.
I think that's a sentiment we can pretty much all agree with.
Mm-hmm. Well, the best game I played last year for the first time was Breath of the Wild, I feel, which definitely didn't come out in 2019. And second probably was Celeste, which came out the year after. But I guess when pressed to pick a 2019 game, one game that stood out to me was Katana Zero. Have you guys played this game or know anything about it?
I actually haven't personally had a chance to play it, but I looked at some of the artwork earlier, and oh my god.
I've read a little bit about it through my work at Critical Distance, and I haven't played it personally, but most of what I read has landed somewhere between comparisons to and also a critical response to Hotline Miami.
Yeah, I feel like it's unfair. I've heard people call it kind of like a side view Hotline Miami, and it does have kind of the retro aesthetics and the assassination, the crazy killing and the one-hit kills of Hotline Miami, but I found it kind of more fun than Hotline Miami, or maybe less frustrating. I guess I can get into what it's about. You play an assassin called Zero, and he's an amnesiac and an assassin. He's dressed as a samurai, and you essentially have to slice up people stylishly throughout every level in like a future that's really steeped in kind of 80s aesthetics. And so, yeah, Hotline Miami is a good place to start for what the gameplay is like. You kind of have to, you have these, for lack of a better word, like boards in each stage that you have to kind of kill everybody in or avoid everybody in a stylish way or not, without getting hit once. But I kind of felt like it was a lot more like Celeste in that it's super hard, but it encourages failure by kind of making failure and repetition like kind of work into the gameplay. And each board is pretty short, so when you die, you're not going back minutes. You're going back seconds rather than like minutes or like tens of minutes like some other games.
So it really does differ from Celeste in that way, where you've gotten 3 strawberries, you finally making that last dash back to your landing zone, and then realize that, I forgot to land in that green bubble, and there's the spikes.
Yes, but it's like Celeste in that when that happens, then you're like back at it like right away. And you've only you got 3 strawberries, but that was like 10 seconds worth of actual time. So like it is hard. I'm not good at games, and this is a hard game, but it's one of those hard games that I don't mind keeping doing things, because it really gets you going right away. But yeah, I guess, I mean, we are academic journals, so to get a little academic, one thing that really attracted me to the game is that memory plays a really big part. So, your character has amnesia, and this is mostly the plot. So he knows he was trained for war, trained to kill. And there's also like cinematics that kind of punctuate every stage where you remember a dream about something that happened to the past, in the past, and things are revealed every time you have this dream. And so Zero, the main character, kind of has to figure out and work through trauma to sort of break out of this endless repetition of, taking on missions for this organization that probably kind of gave him this trauma and trained him as a killer. And I'm being kind of vague because I don't want to spoil the plot. But
do we want to just put that spoiler warning out there and accept that these are games that have been out for some amount of time? If people are really not wanting to do any sort of spoilers, maybe jump ahead a little while? Or do we want to make this a spoiler-free podcast?
I mean, I'm going to try and be spoiler-free. I guess we can say, like, spoiler warning, skip ahead 10 seconds like all podcasts do, and nobody actually does. They just let things get spoiled. But, I don't know. I'll try to be unspoilery. Just kind of setting the stage there, it really reminded me of Mark Fisher, and just how he wrote about how, like, he thinks innovation has ended, or he thought innovation ended in culture and we're just reiterating on the same forms. But then he talks about hauntology, which is a way of confronting what he calls this failure of the future. And by looking to or reconfiguring the past, we can kind of find a way out of this kind of present full of like reiteration. So Katana Zero, we kind of see like steeped in nostalgia, and Zero's own issues with repetition in the past. And he's kind of stuck in this capital realism of that he can't see his way out of until he kind of figures out his past. And it's also, there's a bunch of synthwave music throughout the whole thing. So it's really just like a retro hot mess. But I guess it's also interesting how it deals with trauma and stuff I've stuff I've read about trauma. It talks a lot about like being haunted by the past and how you kind of have to step back to move past it. But one of my biggest problems with the game, and I wonder if you guys read anything about this, is just that I don't know how responsibly it deals with trauma or deals with mental health. Like, it kind of seems like it's using these things to tell like a cool or edgy story. Like Zero goes to a psychiatrist that gives him drugs and assassination assignments, but at the same time, it's almost like reiterating that trope of like, you go to therapy, because you're an edgy dude, or like therapy is conflated with medication and mind control. And I guess as someone with mental illness, I found this kind of uncomfortable. So, I mean, one thing that I found very compelling about Katana Zero is it feels good, and it feels, the game makes it feel good to murder, human beings with their own families and feelings. But it's, it's also, I'm not sure if it's just kind of like a shitty plot that, is it just has crappy mental health tropes in it.
Yeah, I'm going to harken back just to your comment about a retro hot mess, because that seems like a very 2019 thing. But on that idea of trauma and mental health, especially in Katana Zero, and I think that's a common trope that's coming through a lot of games now, especially mental health, coming to the forefront of our own common understanding and common parlance, and that we've gotten very good at talking about it, but not how we talk about it. And it seems that games really are mimicking that. From what I'm hearing you say, Katana Zero may be the key example, or a key example of that.
Yeah, that's something I'd agree with. And along similar lines, the idea that popular games anyway have gotten to the point where they figured out, okay, mental health is probably something worth talking about, but haven't really gotten to the point where there's enough critical awareness or nuance to do these themes justice. Another thing, and I was just kind of pulling ideas out of what you were talking about, Patrick, and I've noticed myself that the games I've been drawn to in recent years touch on some of the themes that you identified, specifically difficult without being frustrating necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
And also games that examine trauma in one way or another, whether successfully or not. I know that when we did this last year, the game I picked for my one true game or game of the year, or whatever we are calling it in the year of Luigi 2020, was Celeste. Because for me, that was the game I needed when I needed it. And I know you just finished talking at length about Katana Zero, but did you also say that Celeste was your pick for this year?
Well, I played it. I can't remember if I started it this year, but I definitely finished it this year. And it was definitely one of my favorite games I played, like over Katana Zero. And I felt like it was very almost therapeutic in itself playing that game.
Yeah, and I had a similar experience. And again, I listed Celeste last time we did this, but I continued to play it because it took a while to get through all of it, right? Mm-hmm. And part of that difficult but not frustrating, it was enough to keep me engaged, but it was a physically exhausting game to play. Like, I can think of maybe 4 or 5 games in recent memory that actually give me like hand cramps to play. The other one I remember back in the day was Super Meat Boy, but Celeste as well. I have about like a 2-hour hard limit before it becomes too painful.
For Celeste, refresh my memory, I've played it on Nintendo Switch, but is that where everybody else has played it? Is it only on Switch?
It's multi-platform. It's on everything. I initially played it on Xbox One. That's where most of my experience came from. I did later pick it up on Switch, but I found the Pro Controller wasn't quite precise enough.
Okay. Yeah, I was just playing with the Joy-Cons, and hand cramping was a serious thing on Switch, so I was curious if that was where it was from. I admittedly haven't finished it, so I'm still in that stage of dying 387 times in one level and then looking at it and going, probably should have gone for that 420th time just so I could get that last strawberry.
Yeah, but I love how when you die in it, or when it introduces you to strawberries, it's like you can get these, but I mean they mean nothing. Or like it's like look at your deaths or your failures as like progress or a process, which I really enjoy. Kind of I guess as I said, reconfiguring failure in games is not failing, but kind of part of working towards beating the game or whatever.
And I found that was a good way for me to measure my experience, for lack of a better word, with the game as well. Because after I got through the initial campaign, I was compelled to go back and find strawberries that I missed. And for some of the A-sides and the B-sides, at least, trying to do deathless runs and all that horrible masochistic stuff, and just watching my death counts for even the easier levels climb into the thousands.
Yeah. I think that comment that you were saying about it not being failure, but it being a method of learning, especially for a game like Celeste and in a way Katana Zero as well, that is so focused around mental health and trauma, framing it in that way becomes so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it becomes a therapy kind of.
And I thought that was something Celeste, to its credit, did a fairly good job reconciling with its narrative, because it sets up this initial premise of mental illness as an allegorical mountain to be conquered. But then, I guess we're getting into spoilery territory here, but I'm not going to give away specific plot details. About 2/3 through the game, it rejects that narrative and instead introduces this idea that mental illness is a part of your identity that you need to synthesize and accept and work alongside to actually get somewhere.
I loved that in the game too. When it happens, and then you get, I guess without spoiling too much, you kind of get an extra set of powers, or extended powers, and that just kind of makes the game more challenging and opens up more things you can do. Yeah, it's really good.
And then the DLC came out and took those extra powers away, and it was rough.
Well, I didn't know about the DLC.
Yeah, a couple of months ago they came out with an extra. It's free DLC, so you don't have to buy anything, and it's basically just a super difficult final chapter.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I loved assist mode. I think every game should have assist mode. Because I definitely used it playing Celeste, and didn't feel bad about it. Like, I would try, several times to defeat an area, but if I was just like, I just want to see what's next, I could put on that assist mode and make it just a bit slower or just a bit slower, that sort of thing. So I feel like every game should have that, so I can enjoy it, and people like me who are not good at video games can also enjoy it.
Yeah, I think that's a common, or becoming more common. One of my favorite games that we're not going to get into today, because I could rant for hours, Nier Automata actually has an entire difficulty setting designed around experiencing the narrative, and it basically fights and goes through the game for you.
Oh,
And having something like that, I didn't even know it was in Celeste. Like, obviously, it's not quite the same as it's just going to play for you, but it's an interesting way to have access to a larger range of people who aren't necessarily in it for the punishment. Those people like me who don't want to play Dark Souls for 13 hours only to get knocked back out of the first room again.
Yeah. Stop telling me that Dark Souls is easy. It's not. You're just trying to flex.
Definitely. Do we want to talk any more about Katana Zero, or do we want to move on to the next best game of 2019 that maybe wasn't actually from 2019? The FPS top games played in 2019.
Let's do it. Let's move on to number 2.
All right. Okay. I guess I can take point on this one. It was a clear-cut choice for me this year, and it was actually a game that came out in 2019 that I found by the end of the year had stuck with me and left the strongest impression. For me, that was Outer Wilds, which I'm going to get through this entire podcast without confusing its title with The Outer Worlds. Okay? Gauntlet thrown, gauntlet picked up, gauntlet critically examined, gauntlet disdainfully tossed aside. Yeah, I'm going to screw this up. So I found in recent years the game I'm left with at the end of the year is the game that's made the strongest affective impact on me. Last year, that for me, that was Celeste. This year, it was Outer Wilds. I guess it's been compared in some ways to Majora's Mask because it has a kind of a time loop structure to it. But again, like how comparisons between Hotline Miami and Katana Zero are kind of surface level. That's, again, Outer Wilds and Majora's Mask, that's a surface level comparison. My attention was first brought to Outer Wilds again through my work with Critical Distance, so reading what other people had to say about it. Particularly, I remember Austin Walker and Cameron Kunzelman, what they had to say about it left an impression on me. But also the fact that everyone who was writing about the game at the time was also saying, you have to play this game before you read anything about it. You're going to be sorry otherwise. Which was somewhat impossible for me to do in my job role, but I managed to avoid most of the spoilers, and I'm going to try and honor that tradition here. But basically, it's a game about the death of the universe and what you can do when you have 22 minutes left over and over and over again. And it's a meditative game in a lot of ways because of that forced cycle. I'm a fairly high anxiety person, and that carries over to my play experiences, and I'm particularly bad with timers. Like, I don't know if anyone here can relate to the anxiety of leaving Sonic underwater for too long.
Oh yeah.
And then, like, the drowning music kicks in. Like,
For
that,
me.
like, that was probably my first 5 or 6 hours with the Outer Wilds, knowing that not only was there a timer, but it's an invisible timer. So I don't know what's happening. I don't know when the time loop is going to reset. And I'm just on edge the whole time playing it. So I found I could only play it in small bursts. And in fact, there were times when I couldn't even get through a whole cycle. I just like, that's too much. I got to turn the game off, reset it. I don't care if I lose my progress. Because what I enjoyed most, at least in my initial hours with Outer Wilds, was just exploring the game world. And it's been a while since there was a game where I felt at ease just exploring. And it's interesting that Outer Wilds had that effect on me, despite the fact it's so constrained, despite the fact that it's got a fairly reined-in environment, and of course there's the time constraint. I've gone on record saying I've never actually beaten an Elder Scrolls game, although I've played most of them. Same with the later Fallout games, but they've always been worlds that I'm more comfortable just kind of inhabiting and goofing off in rather than pursuing the main quest. And that was, strangely enough, an experience that I found Outer Wilds enabled, because it basically, after a first cycle that acclimates you to the game world and to its mechanics, it lets you go off and play without a whole lot of hand-holding. You're in this kind of diorama-like miniature solar system. You can choose where you want to go. Cycle. Everything will be reset at the end of each cycle, but your ship's computer will retain key information that will facilitate exploration on further cycles. But there's no immediate push beyond that, other than, yeah, there's probably a wider narrative here, and there's going to be mysteries and secrets to uncover, but you can do it at your own pace. And that's a weird thought to have, considering it's, again, got that relentless time limit, that source of anxiety that dogged my heels every step of the way. Still, this game, more so than any of the much larger open world games I've played in the past, told me, go, explore, figure it out at your own pace. And I found that having the space to explore that world in this constrained environment, while also taking the time to kind of explore mortality in a way that I haven't gotten from a game in a long time. I found that to be really soothing and comforting in an increasingly precarious point, not only, I suppose, in our globalized history as a whole, but in my own personal life. So for those reasons, those jumbled reasons and many others, that's why Outer Wilds was my game of the year.
Yeah, that balance that you're talking about, that crushing anxiety of that timer looming over you, especially with that pressure that you can't actually see it. It's not like that breath meter in Sonic or The Witcher, which I was admittedly playing last night, where you're constantly having that pressure of quite literally drowning. In a way, it sounds like Outer Wilds almost has a similar experience in space, where you are being drowned by infinity rather than something crushing in around you, but that there isn't that pressure to move forward. It's just that sense of you can always start again and come back to it and do things how you want.
Yeah, in some ways, Outer Wilds, Sonic drowning 100% of the time, but eventually. And yeah, that was initially a really stressful experience for me to navigate, but eventually I acclimatized, I acclimated, I got used to it, and I started to think, okay, so this is the extremely narrow, extremely stressful slice of time that this game has told me I can inhabit. What can I do within that space? How can I make better and better use of that narrow slice of time that I've been given. And that ultimately gives way to some of the larger narratives and mysteries and puzzles to be uncovered in the game. It's about finding more efficient ways to use your time, finding shortcuts to navigate the game world, which resets all of its locks every time the cycle resets, finding new paths, finding better paths. It's almost like it's an experience that's not entirely unlike speedrunning, but because you have so many iterations, infinite iterations to get it right, there's again less pressure than I was expecting after I got comfortable with the game systems.
Interesting. That comparison to speedrunning one came out of nowhere for me, because it seems like the kind of game that you wouldn't ever try to speedrun because you can't. There doesn't seem to be that fixed goal. But it is, like you're saying, that kind of logical speedrunning where you're optimizing yourself to try to get through everything at the same time. Which I'm going to bring back to what you were talking about for the ship saving some of the key information that you found, where there is that sort of ideologic technology that saves particular information that in a way outlives you or mirrors your own human experience. You remember certain things, but the character you're playing does not. And how does that interact potentially with that optimization, the computer of the ship, you yourself as a being, and the character, all as distinct but the same?
Well, I think the character does in fact retain their memory, but they don't have a lot of personality, at least through most of the game. It's mostly the personality of the game mostly comes through the other characters you encounter and the game world itself. You have a couple of dialogue options through your avatar, but they're fairly inconsequential. So for the most part, I'm not thinking about the tension between myself and the player character as I'm playing the game in the way that a more narratively reinforced protagonist might invoke that tension. It's for most of the game, it's literally just me out there in space trying to figure shit out. And bringing it back to that idea of optimization, which you were talking about, the ship's computer is one tool. The other tool, of course, is my memory as a player. And between the two of those things and reading through the logs and remembering, okay, this is the trail of breadcrumbs that has been left for me, optimizing my runs through each cycle to get deeper into different puzzles and mysteries throughout the game world. So, and to give an example of that, let's say there's this one planet that I want to visit. And it's got a couple of ways to get into its interior, and its interior gives way to this labyrinth of structures and puzzles and ruins. The first time I visit that planet, maybe I die right away because I failed to take into account how strong the gravity of the planet was, and I didn't reverse my engines quickly enough, and I just pounded into the surface. Okay, so that's run one. Run two, I land without killing myself, but it takes me a while to find my way into the planet. And by the time I've actually gotten beneath the surface, my time's up. That's run two. Run three, I know where I'm going this time. So I've optimized my run to the center of the planet, but now I've got this maze inside the planet to figure out. So I make some progress in there, but maybe I activate a trap of some kind, and then I die again. That's run three. Run four, now I know how that trap works. I get a little further into the planet. But I notice that there's lots of stuff to stop and read. That's interesting. So I take my time, and the game does pause while you're actually reading messages left behind by whoever wrote the messages. I'm trying not to give away too much here.
Yeah.
So that's run four. Run five, I have all that information in my computer now, so I can review it at my leisure, and I can kind of just beeline my way further into the ruins and find something more interesting. And then I'm in new territory, so I get lost, I take a wrong turn. That's run five. Run six, now I've got most of the interior of the planet figured out, and then maybe I find something really special. So that's the kind of optimization I was thinking of in terms of how you could relate the game to speedrunning in some sense.
it's iterative in a way where every time you learn a little bit, and the game's designed in such a way that you don't always have to do every little thing over again. And from what I'm understanding, that narrative that we're trying really hard not to spoil too much here, it is one of those things that in a way kind of limits how fast you can explore everything. Yeah. But it's also that thing that drives you to keep going, that kind of gives you the motivation to check out that little corner, what's down that set of stairs, what happens if I just use gravity a little bit differently.
Yeah. Absolutely. And yeah, you're right. The game kind of lets you go off and play, but it does give you just enough narrative thrust to keep you digging for more in a way that doesn't feel pushy or coercive, despite the fact, again, it's got that constraint breathing down your neck all the time.
There is a YouTube creator named Jakob Geller that I actually watched a video on Outer Wilds and that inevitability of death and exploration. And that's kind of where I'm coming at this game from, having not played it myself. And he does this really good job in my mind of explaining that sort of desire to discover while recognizing that in the same way that Chris, you are doing here, but it's from a bit of a different perspective. But yeah, there's that need to know more, that need to progress and optimize. I'm curious if, Patrick, you have anything to add on that or ask Chris about.
Nothing on what you guys. I've just been listening to what you guys are talking about with the exploration. I've played a bit of Outer Wilds and found that I had a lot of problem navigating. So I couldn't even play a full run through just because the 0G combined with kind of your motion through the planet just wasn't clicking with my brain. So I'm like, I can't. This doesn't feel good to me. Which I haven't really heard anyone complain about. But one thing I really loved about the game was it's kind of it's space exploration, but there's a real folksy feeling about it. It's like a lo-fi sci-fi kind of thing. Like your spaceship feels like it's made of like old technology, not made for space or like, made out of wood or something like that. I really liked that look of the game.
Yeah, I've never, I think, had a finer appreciation for the banjo than I have with playing Outer Wilds. And you're right, it definitely has kind of a folksy, rustic charm to it. I recall one of the NPCs early in the game comments on the launch pad being made out of wood and saying something to the effect of, it probably won't catch fire. It'll be fine. But beyond that, your entire space program feels like it's literally being held together with duct tape. If you examine your spacesuit in the ship, you can see it's basically stitched together from spare parts, and it gives the whole game kind of this ramshackle, thrown together feel that nonetheless has a charm to it. And I found I got more out of that the second time I started playing the game, because just like you, Patrick, when I first started the game, I didn't know what I was in for, other than the fact that it had been spoiled to me that there was a time limit. So on my first run right away, I'm like up and at 'em. I'm like running around the tutorial planet thinking, okay, I got to get off this rock or I'm going to screw things up from the beginning. So I flew through as much of the preliminary stuff as possible, got off into space, of course had no idea how to fly the actual ship, and I'm pretty sure I took it into a black hole. Or I crashed into the sun. I can't remember. One of the two. And I found it to be frustrating. I'm like, these controls are difficult. I was playing it on Game Pass initially on Xbox, and I thought, would this be easier on PC? I don't know. I don't have an Epic Store account, so I guess I'll never know. And the other thing I found out is that the first run actually doesn't start until you lift off. So my friend was screwing around on the first planet for an hour.
And you're like, he's dead. He's dead soon.
Yeah, I know. Like biting my nails, sitting on the couch next to them going, okay, this is it. I can't take this anymore. They're going to hate it. They're never going to invite me back. But no, never happened. They learned how to play the game at their pace. And when they lifted off, they had a good time. And they had that good time because they weren't spoiled.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I went into it with a certain mindset and a certain expectation for how I would need to play the game. And it kind of sabotaged me a little bit.
That's fascinating. Like, especially once you've gone through the investigation with that 22-minute time limit on it, to have that specifically designed outside of that first time that you're walking around the planet when you're trying to learn, it kind of harkens back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier with the accessibility to a wider range of players that we were talking about with Celeste and Nier Automata when we were talking about Katana Zero with Patrick, where it really does allow you that potential to learn before really throwing you into the depth of, oh my goodness, no, we're just going to repeatedly reset over and over again.
Yeah.
And where those player communities and the way interaction between people can really affect how we learn, but more importantly, how the game lets us learn.
Yeah, and I found that Outer Wilds, once you take it easy, is a game that wants you to succeed. Its controls definitely are an accessibility obstacle. I'm not sure what options the game has to mitigate that, but probably there are limits because the main obstacle is the physics engine rather than the controls, I think.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it'd be worth me trying it again. I just kind of jumped in, was like, I can't, my brain's not working with this, and kind of jumped out. And it being on Game Pass, having Game Pass makes games so much more easier to stop playing. I don't have that kind of monetary investment of like, no, I bought this game, I should see it through.
Oh yeah, I can definitely relate to that mood. It reminds me of I don't know, when I was 15 and I discovered that emulation was like, oh, I can have every Super Nintendo game. And then it was like, well, now I don't want to play any of them.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not a podcast about the subscription service of games, but that does make a good case for why something like that, for especially people in an academic environment where you kind of need to dabble a little bit in games to get that sort of sense, especially as people from first-person scholar or critical distance, where it's good to have a sense of a game that you're reviewing an article for.
And then you will be reading an article that talks really really cool about a video game, buy that video game and hate it. And I'm not going to reveal what that video game is, but that happened to me and I'm bitter about it.
Oh no.
I can only imagine.
That's a mood though.
I can't get that folksy comment out of my head. That sort of, be careful. You're not going to burn the launch pad, but you might. There is that possibility there. And coming from my own background with No Man's Sky, the great, wonderful tale of will it work, will it not work, will we patch it, will we not patch it, where that almost feels like the exact opposite experience, where everything in No Man's Sky feels permanent. The world doesn't really impact the things you create. All of the infrastructure, your ship, yourself, is all in a way pristine in this explorable vacuum of space. Where from what I'm gathering, Outer Wilds really feels like that cobbled together experience that it's designed to be more limited, both physically as well as temporally.
And if I understand correctly, Outer Wilds was a game that was available in some capacity in alpha and beta for a good bit of time before it was formally launched and hit Game Pass and all that stuff. And it was a janky game.
Sometimes those are the best experiences.
And despite the fact that it was a janky game, the pressure was still in place, and surprisingly little changed in a substantial way between those janky betas and the final product. Whereas you have a game like No Man's Sky that was designed to be pristine, polished, sterile almost, and it came out and it was very disappointing. And yet the development team has continued over 2 or 3 years to keep bolting on improvements and expansions and patches, trying to make the game that audiences wanted from the beginning.
Awesome. Patrick, any final thoughts? Chris, any final thoughts? Or do you want to move on?
I think we can move on to you, Leah.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at this saying, so we've brought up No Man's Sky, we've brought up Nier Automata. neither one of those are my game of 2019. Admittedly, as I quite literally now scroll through games of 2019 and look at it, there are very few 2019 games that I've actually played in 2019. I played Pokemon Shield, which was great, but by no means my top game of 2019.
I'm playing that now and I love it.
Oh, don't get me wrong, it's fantastic.
Mhm.
I also haven't played a Pokemon game since Ruby, so like the changes are real. But I'm actually going to call back to 2018 for my final game. Like we were talking about Celeste quite a lot. Because for me, I played the entire game through the course of 2019, and it was, start to finish, one of the most absorbing games I've played in a long time, and it is Detroit Become Human. Absorbing is kind of an interesting quest because you play as an android, or rather you play as 3 androids. I'm going to put a huge spoiler warning here and say I'm going to try not to spoil things, but in a way I'm kind of going to have to kind of talk through it a little bit. So there are 3 main androids that you play. There is Connor, who is a sort of detective sleuth trying to figure out the crime scenes. There is Marcus, who is originally a caretaker, who then kind of branches out and goes on his own adventure. We'll not get too far into that. And then there is Kara, who is essentially a maid. The thing is, with Kara, I'm going to talk about Kara a lot, because I really saw myself in Kara. It seems weird when we're talking about technology, in that you look at, first of all, a game, but then you look at a character in a game, and that character happens to be an android who isn't even human until she is. And that is so much about how this game operates, is that intersection between technology and humanity. For me, in that sort of sense of you are this maid character, housekeeping, looking after the man of the family, but it is not a friendly household to be in. It is this situation where you are constantly put into these situations where any human would immediately push back or leave. And as the player, you were actually given the opportunity as Kara to decide whether to push back or not. And as somebody in my own situation, having officially come out as trans and presenting feminine and that sort of thing, fighting back against the societal pressure to behave a certain way, it was something that I really connected with. But then all of a sudden you start looking at the daughter of this masculine character that you're interacting with. And you have taken care of Alice, is the daughter's name, for goodness knows how long at this point. But it's always been that sort of caretaker, non-maternal way. And then all of a sudden things change. You've already broken your programming to a certain extent to push back against the system. And as a player, you have a choice of how to see it. But for me, as somebody who's never really wanted kids, the interactions with Alice, all of a sudden I felt like a mother. Not just made Kara a mother figure, but I wanted to make sure that Alice had everything that she needed. And there was that sort of weird interpretation of, at what point am I role-playing the character? But at what point am I myself making all of these choices, which the game really facilitated. And it was and is a very strong narrative game. The main interactions are occasional quick time events, some walking around and interacting. The controls of the game, admittedly, are not my favorite, because a lot of the things you interact with are using the right analog stick, which is what you use to move the camera around. So if you're not like particularly looking at something, some weird things can happen. But regardless of that experience, you are given all of these opportunities to, as your own self, interact with the characters and become the characters in a way. And as a trans person, having this sort of ability to become a mother in sort of a non-traditional sense it hit really close to home. I can all of a sudden become an android who is becoming a human, who is looking after this child who you kind of half in a way stole from her father to go on an adventure through Detroit. And it's this sort of weird meta-narrative in a way for my own experience. Not that I'm saying the game was designed around me, because obviously not. But that's how I kind of read into it. And that is, in a way, my own line of work, is I look at the way that the player's experiences become narratives within the game. And Detroit just so perfectly summed up that experience. Connor just bothered me, so we're not going to talk about Connor.
Is he the cop?
Connor's the cop.
Yeah.
He's a narc. But Marcus is an interesting character as well. So I'm just going to quickly explain associations with Marcus, where you have this chance to look after essentially a father figure to you. And then you sort of come into this realm of starting a revolution for the androids to demonstrate that the androids are, in a way, becoming human. Spoiler alert, the title of the game matters. But it's so true in this case, where you are trying to define your own humanity. And Marcus, as the sort of figurehead for that, operated in a similar way to the game as a whole, and Kara especially. And that, as a sort of forced from my own perspective trans allegory, it allows it to happen. And sort of that societal construction and pressure of, what does it mean to be human? What is it to be normal or othered? And in a situation where we are now in the future, androids are at the point where they are functionally better than humans in almost every way. Where does that sort of anxiety and fear for humanity start interfering with our own understandings of ourselves and others?
So you can tell that Lee is kind of hyped for Cyberpunk.
Only a little bit
Yeah.
hyped for Cyberpunk.
Just a
It
teeny
looks
tiny
really
bit.
cool, though.
And it's officially been delayed to September, so when I eventually get to write about it for my disc, it'll be more recent than April. I almost hope it gets delayed another little bit just so it's 2021, but I also don't want all of the hate mail coming to me, so not seriously.
I mean, you don't even know when the multiplayer is coming out. That could be a while. So,
Oh no.
I'm excited for Cyberpunk, slight sidebar, because I love the gameplay of Witcher, but I hate Geralt. I hate playing as him, so like to play a game that's made by those same people, but I can pick my own person, would be fantastic. I haven't played Detroit Become Human because I don't have a PlayStation, but everything I've heard about it sounds amazing, and I'm glad you picked it as a top game, because it just you really kind of summed it up really nicely, especially your connection with Kara, and it really highlights how close you can get to video game characters, which is interesting and has been written about a whole bunch, obviously.
Yeah, the PlayStation exclusivity is obviously an issue. It's the only platform exclusive game we've talked about so far today, as far as I can recall.
Yeah.
And yeah, the way that players really can interact with the characters, and like you were talking about with The Witcher, with Geralt, I also am not a huge fan of Geralt. And just in the same way that I'm not a huge fan of Connor, I can tolerate Marcus, but I really associate with Kara. And having that option to connect, at least for me, really impacts my enjoyment of a game.
Mm-hmm.
So that tension between player and player protagonist is something that's come up a couple times in our conversation this afternoon. And I know that Quantic Dream's games are known primarily for their cinematic storytelling approach. This idea that they create these believable, identifiable characters, sometimes with limited modes of interaction. But nonetheless, it's the cinematic storytelling approach and the believability of the characters that I think are some of the studio's hallmarks. And Yulia, you found there was one protagonist in this game of 3 protagonists that you were really strongly drawn to and identified with in some ways, to the point where you were basically able to tolerate the other 2. Like, one was fine, but the other one was not.
For me personally, yeah.
But it was still enough to carry the whole game's experience for you.
Yeah, and I think that is something that they've done really well with Detroit. I, for the life of me, cannot think if I've played any other games by the developer. I probably have and just don't know it. But I think having that multi-protagonist option, especially for a game that you don't get to choose who your player is, it does give you some flexibility of connecting with a game where someone like Geralt, even somebody like Link or Master Chief that is sort of a hollow shell, is still a certain protagonist form. And having this multi-protagonist narration really allowed me, and I expect a lot of other people, to interact with the game in a different way, and a more intimate way, if you will. It's a story. I don't want to spoil a whole lot. The one reason I kind of can tolerate Marcus and accept it is North, who is a character you get to know later on, who, not gonna lie, have a small crush on North. If I could have had North and Kara end up together, it would have been great, but we're not going to ship too much here today. But yeah, you're right. It is very much a cinematic story game where it isn't that sort of exploration, adventure, FPS so much as it is a movie that you're making happen. And that might, in a way, impact at least my own interaction with the characters in the game. Is there almost somebody that you interact with more in that sort of film or TV environment than you do in a traditional game experience?
And I've heard criticisms of, and they're not good criticisms, of Detroit Become Human or other David Cage games as not real video games, which is I'm always attracted to the not real video games or the walking simulators, because I find that more often than not, you do have an emotional connection. It's almost like they open up by kind of taking away from the sort of heavy, skill-challenging gameplay. They open up more of a personal connection to the games. They allow space for it.
I think that's perfect. I'm not sure if I could summarize it any better than that. Having played the game and you having not played the game, you have done the perfect summary of that experience.
Excellent. Well, I was thinking more of my experience with Firewatch and how... Have you guys played Firewatch?
About half of it.
Okay.
I've watched the trailer.
Okay. It's very much like it just opens up with the most devastating, like, written out story, and then it's just like, and you're this guy, and it really touched me. Just having to inhabit this guy's lonely kind of period in his life, and yeah, there isn't much gameplay. You kind of just walk, you find your way around, and you almost like experience this mundane story, but it's more about this guy's emotional journey. But yeah, again, it allows the space to inhabit this character instead of having to worry about, like, min-maxing, to steal a term from D&D.
Min-maxing has gotten much deeper than just D&D.
Yeah.
But yeah, that emotional journey, like you're saying with Firewatch, it's absolutely present in Detroit, and your choices exponentially matter. Not to spoil the game, because it doesn't really spoil anything. Characters that you play can die, and the story will continue without them.
Oh, wow.
And in this way, it really does build that emotional tension with the characters, where not only do you not want to see them leave, but you want to see what's actually going to happen to them and with you. And it does have this very nice fishtail, everybody comes together in the end, blah, 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 blah. I'm making it sound way happier than it actually is. But it really depends on your choices, how that happens and in what way. And it is an emotional journey that ultimately you get to decide whether you know it or not.
That's cool. If only PlayStation had a better controller, I might check this game out.
That's the hill you're gonna die on, the controller. I mean, I heard they just launched a peripheral that adds more buttons. Does that help?
Just move that left stick. Like, move that left stick up. I don't want to reach my thumb all the way down.
Yeah, I hear you.
I grew up on PlayStation. I honestly have never played beyond just at friends' houses on an Xbox with an Xbox controller. So to me, having them parallel and level is what I'm used to.
Right.
But I can imagine for other people.
For playing the D-pad, it's perfect. But yeah, just the analog stick on the left thumb there. And I have stubby fingers though, so that could be it.
We're not going to blame your stubby fingers. We're going to blame the UI design of games,
yes,
the actual core mechanics of games, and the way that they the controller. And that is something that I was complaining a little bit about Detroit earlier, is the way that different controls operate in different ways. Okay, so we have brought up each of our top games. We have Katana Zero / Celeste. I'm going to let Celeste sweep in there a little bit more.
I think Patrick also mentioned Breath of the Wild.
Yeah, but I mean, that's everybody's top game, so of 2017.
Yeah, but how many people's top game in 2019, 2020?
That's true. It is such a beautiful game. But no, let's stick with Celeste and Katana Zero.
So we have Celeste, Katana Zero. We have The Outer Wilds, Detroit Become Human, and they are all so different in so many ways. And it's just interesting, at least to me personally, to have three people with our own backgrounds come into this conversation to bring these games to share. And even without having played either of the games, I've played Celeste, but Katana Zero I have not, to be able to listen to each of you talk about it and to find that passion and be like, I want to play these games now. It is as much my connection with each of you as well as how you and your passion for these games comes through that makes them interesting.
Yes.
That's very beautifully put.
That actually leads me into another question, possibly worth pondering as we start to wind ourselves down here. Is there a game that came out in 2019 that you didn't have time to play, but would like to make time to play, just as a product of our precarious lives as grad students, where it feels like we don't have time for anything?
So you are asking us to, at the beginning of 2020, make our expected top 2020 FPS games that are not necessarily from 2020 in preparation for next year.
I just feel like the beginning of the year is a good time to backlog shame you for the last year.
That's fair. I have admittedly picked up The Outer Worlds and have maybe 3 hours into the game have made some horrible mistakes already, but that's beside the point.
Did you kill the whole town yet?
Not quite.
Okay. You'll get there.
So it's one of those games that is on my current radar, but the one that really stood out to me that I've been waiting to try to convince myself to buy for no reason other than grad school and time commitment and financial commitment is Control.
Oh god, that was mine too.
Oh yeah.
So do we want to talk about Control just for a minute before we call
Three people who have
I
never
haven't played it, but I
Control.
really want to play it.
Yeah, same here. I was told that it was a Metroidvania, and it was weird, and that the protagonist was really good, and that's all I...
From the little bit that I've read about and seen about it, to draw back on what Patrick was saying earlier, that sort of hauntology, it seems like something that would be a really interesting way to play through Control.
Well, a friend of mine, Andrew Bailey, who's actually written for FPS before, was talking about Control, and we were talking about Mark Fisher because we're academics and we have pretentious conversations. And he was saying about this idea of a new weird. And he was saying Control kind of epitomizes this new weird. And it really makes me want to kind of play this game.
Cool. So, Patrick, do you have any other 2019 backlog games too?
Yeah, well, there are games that I kind of more found out about at the end of 2019 and at the beginning of 2020. It's Annndd 2, and I haven't played the original Annndd, and A Short Hike. And these are both, quote, indie games. Annndd 2 is kind of like a dungeon crawler Zelda type game that plays with like low poly visuals as well as pixel graphics. And then A Short Hike is just you play anthropomorphic animals, and I don't know, apparently it looks really cool, and it's supposed to be a fun short game. I don't know too much about them, but I wish I played them last year.
Well, I look forward to the discussion later down the line about how those games are.
Mm-hmm.
And Chris, having stolen Control out from under you.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a replacement. When I got to the end of the year, there were two games I was going to inevitably buy at some point. One was Control, the other was Jedi Fallen Order. And part of that is because it's been so long since there's been like a substantial single-player Star Wars experience in game form. I feel like it's been like a good decade. The Force Unleashed games were probably the last big single-player Star Wars games, and I've always had a certain affinity for Star Wars games, and I'm trying to come up with a smarter answer than I'm just like super into Star Wars, but that's probably what it comes down to. And tensions between adaptation and the ecosystem of licensed video games notwithstanding, Star Wars games have historically been pretty good, right? And not just pretty good, but varied experiences, right? They cover a lot of ground, a lot of different genres. I feel like 5 of my top 10 games from the 2000s decade were probably Star Wars games. One of the Knights of the Old Republic games is probably up there. Republic Commando might be the only squad-based military shooter I've ever like unreservedly enjoyed start to finish. Does the pod racing video game count as 2000s, or was that 1999?
Oh,
That
I think it's on the precipice.
Yeah.
Another Star Wars game is Shadows of the Empire, which I played so much as a kid.
Oh, I just started playing that a couple weeks ago again.
It's hard to go back to.
I found it's a lot easier if you play it in first-person mode. The third-person camera is complete jank.
Okay, interesting.
But it reminds me that there was a time where Star Wars games reliably each year. And we don't live in that ecosystem anymore because games have gotten, well not only because EA has a stranglehold on the copyright, but because AAA games as a whole have gotten so fucking expensive to make. So fewer dedicated experiences come out every year now, and you're getting more of these forever games, these live service multiplayer focused experiences like your Battlefronts, which are designed to last several years and keep monetizing themselves with some kind of economy or ecosystem. So there's less room in the industry now for a game like Jedi Fallen Order, and if it's for that reason among many that I'm interested in picking it up and seeing what it's like at some point. I've heard it's kind of jank, and I've heard that the protagonist is supremely disappointing.
I heard that too.
But that nonetheless, it's got a pretty satisfying gameplay loop, and outside of that, protagonist has a fairly meaty and interesting narrative.
Cool.
Yeah. Like all mainstream games that are $80 at launch and aren't Nintendo, I'll probably wait till they're around $20 or come to Game Pass, but I'm really looking forward to when that happens.
That's such a mood, though, right? And part of that is we've got things like Game Pass now where we cross our fingers. I really hope this game comes to Game Pass because I can't afford to spend $80 on it because we're in Canada and the games are more expensive.
Mm-hmm. And that's 80 before taxes. So we're talking about almost 100.
Yeah, it's 90-something after tax. I should have it memorized to the decimal place for the number of times I brought a Nintendo game to the counter at EB. And they've run me up, and I've thought, what have I done with my life for Luigi's Mansion?
Yeah, that's one of the things I always forget because I do so much of my gaming still on PlayStation 4, and tax just doesn't seem to exist in the online store for some reason. If it's $79.99, it's $79.99. But as soon as I walk into EB Games and pick up Pokemon Shield off the shelf and set it down on the counter, I tell you that your total is going to be $93.18. And I just go, wait. Pull up my wallet, watch the flies come out, and say that'll be on credit, and move on. But we've kind of digressed a little bit from Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order and how it is ever present in the back of our minds, sort of modern remake of Star Wars. And it's interesting to see this kind of come back to that more narrative focused, less online version of it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So on that, I think that's a good point for us to say thank you everybody for listening. Chris and Patrick, as well as myself, would like to thank each one of you. And with that, we look forward to hearing ourselves and look forward to having all of you.
Do you guys want to toss out any plugs or anything? Like Chris, you were talking about Critical Distance. Did you want to talk about that at all?
No, I'm not going to do that here.
Okay. Leah, any social media?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Lillian_A_black, or of course you can find us all through First Person Scholar's website.
Excellent. Yes, only find me through First Person Scholar. I don't really have social media. And give me a book review. I love book reviews.
Yes, we are always open to ideas and concepts. We will help you develop them into the best of the best.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of First Person Podcast, produced by Giuseppe Femia with support from the Games Institute at the University of Waterloo and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council Connections Grant. If you would like more FPS content, find us on Twitter at FPS Weekly. Thanks for listening.